Wonderful. How nice to see you all this morning. And I just wanted to start off. So I'm pretty sure you've all done one of these before, but just to remind you, so this is one of the Nature Writing Hours sessions. This is the fourth one in the series, Nature Diaries with Pizzazz. I'm Amanda Tuke. I'm a nature writer. That's what I do for a living. I'm a botanist and birder based in suburban South London, and the housekeeping. So as I said, if you can rename yourself, that's perfect. Wonderful, Gloria. It always makes me laugh when your iPad pops up.
It does it every time and I have to change it. It drives me mad.
Don't worry, don't worry. Um, so all I would ask is that when we're doing the writing exercises, you stay muted, please, just so other people can concentrate. Do stick questions in the chat, and I will keep an eye on that and try and respond while you're doing the exercises. And when we do have the discussion session, well, there's not many of us this morning, so I will just open you all up to an open discussion, assuming we get too many late arrivals after we've started. And the live transcription is enabled, so if you need that, you should be able to access that through the menu. Okay, so with no further ado, let's start. So the plan for today, so we're going to do 3 writing exercises as we normally do. But the thing that's a little bit different for this session, many of you have done the thumbnail nature courses before. This is slightly different in that I'm asking for a little bit more writing from you, but I'm hoping you'll see how it could build on what we've done for thumbnail nature before. And the idea is to lead to a nature diary entry. So I'm going to share with you some short readings from other people's nature diaries, which are a bit of fun. We're going to have a writing focus where I'm going to ask for your views on a nature writing issue. We'll talk about what the takeaways from the session are, and then if you'd like to, it would be lovely for a bit of sharing at the end. So that's what I'm hoping we're going to pack into this hour. What we need to do, therefore, is get going with the writing. So, exercise 1, the warm-up. So what I asked you to do as a pre-workshop activity was spend some time in nature, as I always do. And ideally you would base this on that nature experience. So what I want you to have a think about is, this is all about titles. So imagine that you are using your nature experience as the basis of your nature diary entry. And sometimes it can be useful to start thinking about what the title of your nature diary entry is right at the start. But I'm going to ask for a range from you. So what I'm after is something from which is deliberately mundane as a title to on a scale up to deliberately quirky. So see how far you get. Obviously start wherever you want in that range, whatever feels fun. But it's just to get you thinking about what is it that you're going to try and say in your nature diary? What are you sharing with the reader? So you've got about 5 minutes to do that. So I'm going to mute now and leave you to it. I mean, obviously the length of those titles is entirely up to you. Over to you. So you've got a minute left. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. They may have been quite difficult. I'm hoping that you at least come up with two. So just to get you thinking about different ways that you could title a piece. And I'm going to now share with you some other nature diaries. So I make no apology for the fact that these are all from the Guardian Country Diary. So although there are a number of newspapers who have some kind of nature column, um, and I was having a look round at the weekend to see who else was doing them. So the Telegraph have nature notes, for example. Um, but I think there's absolutely no, this is a personal view, absolutely no contest that the Guardian does it better than everybody else. If nothing else, they allow a longer word count than all of the others. But also, I think they're compared to, for example, the Evening Standard, which also does nature notes. They tend to, the Standard has they're very kind of very little literal, kind of prescriptive. Here is something you might see in nature this week, which is absolutely fine and serves a great purpose. But I think the Guardian allows the writers to do things that are much more interesting. Anyway, so these are all Guardian Country Diary entries. And what I'm showing you here is the title, the subtitle, and the first paragraph. So in all cases, there's more. For Paul Evans, there's at least another 2 paragraphs. I think Anita has another 4 paragraphs. But I deliberately picked 3 that were quite different. And I suppose one thing that's worth saying, as a writer, when you submit your so if you've been commissioned to write an article, as I am for Birdwatching magazine, you send off your text on the agreed subject. I always put a title, and I see it as a bit of a result if they use the title that I proposed. And they don't always. Sometimes they will look at it, go, I think we could do something different, and then the editor will write his or her own title instead. So although I'm sharing these with you, I'm hoping that they were proposed by the writer. Perhaps they were, but they might have also been proposed by the Guardian. So that's just something to be aware of. And it's not an insult, it just means they want to pitch it in a certain way. Anyway, so here are 3 quite different things. So Paul Evans, to start off with. So Blackbird Singing in the Rain. Wenlock Edge, theirs was a song filled with confidence and daring, as if the wind and rain which silenced other birds had suddenly opened a space exclusively for blackbirds. Only blackbirds sang, defiant, enchanting. Blackbirds weathered the storm through song, from inside huge green skirts of horse-chestnut trees, from hedges where emerging sycamore leaves turn the colour of meat cuts on a butcher's counter, from the hopelessly pretty flowering cherries shredding into many weddings' worth of pink confetti, the blackbirds sang. Theirs was a song filled with confidence and daring, as if the wind and rain which silenced other birds had suddenly opened a space for an exclusively blackbird performance. I absolutely love Paul Evans. I always, whenever he's written for The Guardian, I always get very excited and can read that straight away. A fun title. It's prosaic. Yes, it's talking about blackbirds singing in the rain. There's sort of echoes of the Paul McCartney song, Blackbird Singing in the Dead of Night, but also it echoes singing in the rain. And I think he does quite interesting things. What's he doing in that first paragraph? So He's using lists. So we had all of the different, he's describing the different things he is seeing, but in a very list format. Lots of semicolons, which is brave, I think. There's a repetition of the expression blackbird sang, which then also appears in the later pieces. So if you did have a chance to read the whole piece, when I sent out the links, you'll have seen that that's a kind of repetition. Fabulous metaphors, huge green skirts of the horse chestnut trees. The whole pink confetti thing I just think is beautiful. That hopelessly pretty flowering cherries. But then the kind of a rather contrasty description of the colour of meat cuts, which is not perhaps what you're expecting to find in something that's otherwise quite sort of lyrical and perhaps a little bit sentimental. So there's a kind of bit of a sharp thing in there, which kind of draws attention to itself. And I think in that first paragraph, what he's achieving, so he's setting both the scene of where he is. I mean, yes, you are told Wenlock Edge, but if you've never been to Wenlock Edge, you wouldn't necessarily know what that looked like. But he's also he's not pointing out the season specifically, but you get a sense of season. So it's feeling, it's obviously the time when flowering cherries, so sort of spring, late spring perhaps, depending on what sort of cherries they are, and birds singing. So we've got that. It's also setting the tone, I think, of the kind of writing you're expecting to see in the rest of the piece. So quite poetic, but also about, you get a real sense of the writer's feelings in this, without him saying, this is how I felt. It gives a sense of what the rest of the piece is going to be. So that's Paul Evans. And if you haven't had a chance to read the whole piece, I would encourage you to do that after this session. So the second one, Anita Roy, who some of you may have done the joint workshop she did with me last year. So she's also a wonderful writer, and this is something that I thought was fun because it was quite different. So these wild grasses whisk me back to childhood, Wellington, Somerset. There are a bewildering number of species bursting forth, conjuring memories of summers past. We're a month beyond midsummer and have hit peak grass. The narrow lanes that wind through the countryside round here are narrowed further with the overspill of hedgerows on either side. The hedges have lost the shocked, raw look after the springtime flail and are bursting and frothy with life. Bracken tumbles onto the tarmac through sheer weight of numbers in an unruly pitch invasion. The umbellifers lift their lacy white parasols to the blazing sky, and 12-foot-high nettles lean in, hoping to skim some passing skin with their sting. That last bit's quite difficult to read, actually. So quite a different sort of title, perhaps a little bit more poetic than Paul Evans, but it does give you a sense of what she's going to talk about. So this is a title, I think, that really does what I call after Elle Rose's coining the phrase, doing some heavy lifting. Titles that do heavy lifting can set the tone right at the start for the rest of the piece, and I think this does this brilliantly. So we are expecting at somewhere in this piece her to be referring to her personal history. If you got to the end and there hadn't been any reference, I think we'd be scratching our heads. So it's doing that right at the start. Quite a different tone from Paul Evans, much more sort of colloquial, chatty, bit of a kind of journalistic feel to it, with things like peat grass and pitch invasion. So more humorous as well. And lots of fun verbs. I loved the nettles leaning in and the bracken tumbling onto the tarmac. So she's brilliant at that. That's one of the things I always notice in Anita's writing. So, and you can do lots with verbs that mean you don't have to have loads of adjectives joined up together. Verbs sometimes can just cut through it. So once again, in terms of what that first paragraph is and title is achieving, scene setting here, she's been explicit that we're a month beyond midsummer. There's a sense of exuberance and fun about it, and that expectation of the writer's personal history. So that's Anita. And then the last one, so the Guardian fairly recently started doing a Guardian Young Country Diary, and so that's open to children of all ages. And so I thought this one was fun. So it's by Woody, who they don't give a surname, they just put age 10. And there's a flying hot dog in my garden. Carmarthenshire, Wales. I was watching the bird feeder when there was a brown flash, but what was it? It was a mystery I needed to solve. At the back of our house we have some bird feeders. They're very busy and I love to pull up a chair to watch. There's always something to see, like blue tits, coal tits, sparrows, siskins and nuthatches. But the other week we had a new visitor. I was watching the birds when out of the corner of my eye I saw a flash of light brown. At first I thought it must have been a mouse, although it looked different. So what fun. Great title there. And I was also pleased because I wrote a piece about a year ago, which in fact was inspired by the photograph of the hummingbird hawk moth that's at the start of this presentation. Mine was called There's a Sprite in the Garden. So what we're both trying to do with that is make the reader go, a what? And be intrigued enough to read the rest of the piece. So it's a bit fun and sets up a bit of mystery and intrigue right at the start. Bearing in mind Woody, don't know if he's a boy or a girl, is only 10, quite extraordinary the kind of quality of this. Lots of devices in there, that domestic tone, the pulling up the chairs, really nice. You get that real sense of how Woody spends his or her time. And but also, once again, more lists, and lists are quite often used in first paragraphs and then expanded in later paragraphs. So, like the others, it achieves the scene setting. We don't know when he's talking about in terms of season, but it does set up the rest of the piece for what we call the reveal. You know, at some point we expect to find out what that brown flash was. So lots of fun, and the title, it has a kind of tabloid feel, doesn't it? It's a bit like My Stepmother's an Alien, and it has a sort of it's fun as well. But yeah, once again, quite a different piece to the other two, and hopefully giving you a sense of the range of possible things that you can do with titles and first paragraphs. So, bearing in mind what we've talked about there, what I would like you to do, so hopefully now you've got some thoughts on what might be appropriate title for your nature diary entry, but for exercise 2, what I'm going to ask you to do is to start planning out the whole entry. So this may have been something that you've done before, or it may not. So I've given you lots of ideas of how to go about it. So you're not actually writing the thing. What you're doing is thinking about what you're going to try and do in each paragraph. And one way of doing that is to, as I've put in the example there, to do it in terms of asking questions. So what questions are your paragraphs going to answer? So that can be a way of doing it, and that tends to be what I do. But bear in mind as you're writing this, so those pieces that we were looking at were either 3 or 5 paragraphs, and if you look across a whole range of those country diaries, they tend to be 3 or 5 paragraphs. There's something about the odd number, I think, is kind of works better for us. So as you're thinking about what you put in each paragraph, be conscious of the beginning, the middle and the end of your nature story. So in other words, create a narrative arc. So ideally what you aren't doing is just saying, I've got this thing to tell you, and I've got this thing to tell you in the second paragraph, and I've got this thing to tell you in the third paragraph, because that doesn't go anywhere. So what you need to think about is how are you going to turn your experience into some kind of story which will come to a natural conclusion. The other thing to think about is what your reader will get from it. And I think we had a sense from those 3 that we looked at there of what the reader thinks they're going to get from the rest of the piece. So I've given you examples of what you might put in a 3-paragraph piece there. And obviously, if you didn't get a chance to do the pre-workshop activity specifically for this, then base it on any past nature experience. In fact, you could do that anyway if you suddenly thought, damn it, what I really want to write about is when I saw that, or when I found that buzzard nest, or whatever. So that's entirely up to you. But at the end of it, you should have some planned out paragraphs so you would know what you were going to write in all of them. So you've got about 10 minutes to do that. And I will give you a 1-minute warning as we get close to the end. So do stick some questions if you have any in the chat, and I will answer them as quickly as I can. Okay, over to you. Okay, you've got a minute left. Okay, you wouldn't mind pausing where you are. Right, I'm just going to turn off the recording before we start the next. Recording. That didn't work. So let's go on to the final exercise. So perhaps no surprise, the final exercise, I would like you to write that opening paragraph of your nature diary entry. So your final nature diary entry could be anywhere from 100 to 300 words. Guardian Country Diaries are at the 300 word end, but if you are at the stage where just doing something longer than a thumbnail nature is still quite scary, then you might want to stick to the 100 end. That's up to you. But this first paragraph, let's see how much of that we can get nailed in this session, and spend a little bit of time, if you have time, editing and polishing that and your title, whichever title you're currently leaning towards. We should have about 10 minutes. We might have to keep the sharing bit at the end a bit shorter than usual. And I was only going to ask you to share titles for that anyway. So I'm going to leave you to it. I'll give you a 1 minute warning as we approach the 10 minutes. Over to you. You've got a minute to go. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Hopefully that's not too painful. And just before we finish off, so what have we been doing today? Well, so in the words of the wonderful flash fiction writer Elle Rhodes, if you don't follow her, I would please encourage you to follow her. So she talks about titles doing some heavy lifting, which of course in flash fiction, which is very short fiction pieces, can be brilliantly useful, and it works brilliantly for nature diary entries too. So then the second thing was we talked about being creative, create, not fabricate. So if you're actually not telling the truth, then I think once you've crossed that line, then it's a slippery slope, as our government is currently discovering. But and as always, do spend about a third of your time writing and 2/3 editing and polishing. And that's also something, you know, whether you're doing thumbnail nature, whether you're doing longer pieces like this, it's so critical to make sure that you maximize, or you don't have anything in there that is not necessary, that doesn't advance your narrative arc. So please do complete your whole nature diary piece. I think it will give you a sense of satisfaction if you do that. Edit it, read it aloud, edit it, give it a final polish. And if you'd like it to be considered for inclusion in the online anthology on my blog, as I've done before, please email it to me at that email address. If you could please do it by the end of Monday, that would be brilliant. It just means that I can edit them all at the same time. I may suggest edits to you on these pieces, particularly because they're longer pieces. And that's, you know, whether you choose to take those on or not, that's entirely up to you. Do include, when you send it, do include your Twitter name if you have one, and then when I do post the anthology on Twitter, I can tag you in. And if you have any relevant photos that fit with your piece, that would be great too. This time I'm going to do something a little bit different across the two workshops, which is I have this beautiful book which is called Everyday Nature, which has absolutely lovely sort of watercolour illustrations, and it's basically 365 nature diaries, so it feels very appropriate, and that will go to one of the people who submit their piece, the one that I think achieves what we've been trying to do today the best. So it's just a bit of fun. But if you don't feel able to submit, then please do at least share your piece with one other person so that you get some feedback. And if you haven't already, do please consider signing up for the final workshop, which is about perfect pitches. So the idea is to talk about how, if you do want to, if you've got a great idea for a piece like a nature diary entry and you want to try it on your local newspaper or a magazine or etc., just ideas for how to go about that and what you will send them. So that's what we're going to be doing in the final session. And it'll be about writing too, so even if you don't think you ever want to do that, I think you'll still find it interesting. But I was hoping, I'm going to now turn the recording off again. I was hoping that somebody might be persuaded to share at least some ideas for titles with us.